Welcome everyone to Module 7, Week 7. Uh, so as usual, I'll share a little bit about my reactions to the discussion posts. And then this week, I'm just going to provide actually a case example to highlight a little bit about Super's adult stages and as well as career crises and transitions. So just a case example that I've had with the client. And then I'll chat a little bit about the articles. So first off with discussion posts, overall, thanks once again for engaging and for looking up a lot of really cool articles. I thought it was great that there are a lot of like qualitative as well as quantitative approaches, meaning that like it seemed like some of them there was a lot of like computer assisted program, I guess, interventions for adolescents. And I thought that was really interesting. Some of them were pretty creative, like using gamification, and not just like standard assessments. I thought that was pretty interesting. But what are your reactions to that? That a lot of these interventions were computer based. I think there's pros and cons to that. I think it reaches obviously a lot of students, a lot of people. It initiates the career, like it might prompt a lot of career counseling thoughts in teens who might not have had it. So I think it's a broad way to capture a lot of individuals, but I think, it might start to play into that dynamic that, I need assessments to help me in this career search process. And that they are central to this process. I think that can be challenging if that's the norm that adolescents are receiving, that, check, I've done the career assessment thing. So I think that's one of my reactions, and that's been a common reaction of mine throughout this course. But I think, career assessments are helpful as they spark thought, not as a final conclusion. So I think that's the one critique maybe I'd give to a lot of those computer assisted is like helping teens understand that that's not it, this is just opening the doors to possibilities. And then there's a lot more self-reflection. There's a lot more experience that needs to occur. But yeah, there are also, a lot of those much more humanistic and kind of like narrative approaches to career construction interview, which we'll talk a little bit more about this semester. But there were, plenty of those more arts-based and creative approaches to career development work with teenagers as well. So I thought that was important. I appreciated those being included. And there are a lot of international samples, and that's pretty common from my experience, that there's usually quite a bit of research from all over the world on career development. So I think that really speaks, I think that's a strength that we can learn from a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different voices. The last thing that I wanted to mention about the discussion post was there were quite a few APA issues. So it wasn't a huge deal for the most part, it wasn't a huge deal, just, with it being the discussion boards, but I really want to encourage you to fine tune your understanding of APA for the paper, because that'll be important that, there's a lot more clarity there. So in-text citations, remember you need to include the author or authors, the year, and the page number. A lot of times the page numbers were being left off. Also look at the details on the reference list. So how to cite in the reference list. For the most part, it's pretty close, but there have been some pretty frequent errors. So I'll post, and a lot of you may have already heard of, Purdue OWL that goes over APA, the website. So I'll post that, but if you have the APA manual, that's the best source. But yeah, Purdue OWL for APA does help quite a bit, gives some good examples. So I'll post that this week as you're preparing to submit your paper, your autobiography. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to go over, in the written lecture, I went over already a lot of information from the Scharf text on Super's final stages, as well as career transitions and crises. So what I wanted to share was a case example. So one of my actually first clients that I worked with as an intern, actually, so it's been a while. So I'll just describe a little bit about this client and then kind of talk about how it intersects with the ideas of Super's developmental model, as well as, career crises. So he was in his late 40s, I think around 48, 49 years old. He was working full-time in the psychiatric unit at a hospital, but he was attending school full-time actually as well, a master's degree in health education. And he was married with teenage children. I believe it's 2 children, a boy and a girl. And the presenting concerns that he came with was kind of confusion about his career path. He was kind of reconsidering, is this the right path for me? Is this where I need to be going? Should I even do this health education degree? He was also really frustrated at work. Work was not a good fit, not a good experience for him. It was really draining, and he was regularly angry about his work. And there was some family problems too, family problems, particularly with his kids. And he was really concerned about, how his kids were behaving and how they're growing up and his role with them. And then I experienced him kind of as having like a low self-esteem at the time, due to all these factors. So one thing that I wanted to highlight first is the idea of recycling. So he was kind of at that maintenance stage, but then due to going back to school and really being dissatisfied with his career, he's kind of going back to that exploration. So that was, but I think that recycling phase and recycling process of going kind of between these stages, not in a linear fashion, but just kind of going around in a more jumbled fashion, I think can be a really challenging process, because he's kind of in that maintenance, kind of moving towards retirement pretty soon in the near future. I guess 10 years in near future, it seemed to him to be a little bit more, obviously on the horizon rather than, 40 years down the road or 30 years down the road. So I think that may have been part of that career confusion of like, what am I doing? When should I be making these changes? Should I be making this change? Is it worth it? So I think the recycling process can sometimes be disorienting and almost like shaking, kind of like a foundation maybe has been established. Then I guess through that establishment maintenance categories of Super's model. But then if there's a recycling process, then that foundation is quivering and shaking, almost like this inner earthquake. So yeah, I think that's where the recycling process kind of sounds like, oh yeah, you can recycle and that's normal, but it can be really hard. It can be challenging. And I think once again, that's part of why the next chapter talks about career crisis and transition. And I really think, for this client, it ended up being, to me, much more of like a life crisis rather than as much of a career crisis, but they obviously go hand in hand. So as we work together, so we talked a lot about his career frustration, and just a lot of it was just reflecting feelings, helping him make meaning of his experience. We didn't really need to do any assessments because he was just either doing this path or just kind of maybe going back to his previous role or just kind of looking for a new job. So that he didn't really need or want or really ask a lot for assessment. But we were able to explore his anger at work. And that's actually the first time that I had to assess for homicide, because he was really getting angry. And there was a little bit of like thoughts of wanting to hurt some of his colleagues. Luckily, it wasn't imminent. There weren't like specific plans, and he was reporting that he would never do it. It was more just kind of at the thoughts level, but still pretty concerning. But he kept coming back time and time again to his kids, to his relationship with his kids. And I finally reflected that to him, that it seems like, a lot of the core, there's a lot of stuff going on, but a lot of what we keep going back to is your relationship with your kids, that you're really concerned about them and about, maybe your lack of presence with them. You want to be more present. You want to be more involved. You want to be helping them more. And you're concerned about the direction they're going. So that really kind of like, he's like, oh, it kind of struck him and led him to, start to make more shifts in his role as a father. So I think this kind of, once again, it impacts the career rainbow, Super's rainbow, of that role being really salient. That father and husband role was really important. So making changes in that role kind of led to, the confusion about his career path and his master's degree kind of dissipating. So he chose to stay, and emphasizing his relationship with his kids kind of resolved some of the overall friction. So it was kind of hard for him to sort out, where is this friction coming from? But through our work, like, it seemed like, he finally kind of came to the conclusion that it's mostly with my family. So he worked on that, and then there was greater clarity in other places. So I think that's why career crises can be pretty complex and maybe not be exactly, linear in one role, one life role, that they're all intermixing. So making sense of the larger life context can be super important. So hopefully that kind of gives one example of maybe a case study, hopefully to help support you with the discussion this week, but then also to kind of see how career crises and recycling and the different stages can kind of all intersect. Okay, I just want to share a few thoughts on the articles now, and then I'll wrap up. So the articles are kind of making a shift. They're not really focusing as much on like the developmental theories or the career crises. They're shifting away from trait and factor theory and the developmental theories to special focus theories. So that's going to be the next section of the Scharf text. So it's kind of creating a bridge to that. So the Praskova et al. Article talked about the construct and the idea of career calling. So these authors defined career calling as a personally meaningful, other-oriented, and active engagement. So a career calling kind of sparks those three things. I think, the idea of career calling can often be kind of bring up spirituality as well. For some people, that means religion. For some people, it doesn't. But it definitely kind of brings in a spiritual element into career work. And I think Dick and Duffy, they were referenced in the Praskova article, but they wrote an article in 2009 on career calling, and they defined career calling as a transcendent summons to like experience meaning through a life role, in this case, a career life role that has a pro-social orientation. So I think that's there's obviously some overlap with the first definition that I gave, but I think that idea of a transcendent summons is a little bit different. So for some people, like they talk about that historically a calling has had kind of like this orientation to like a higher, power, God for certain populations, but a transcendent summons, they kind of broaden it to be, it could be like a secular perspective on that too, of like kind of the transcendent summons could be calls from society to help in a certain career role. Could be an inner summons, something that someone feels deeply inside of them that they feel like, there's a work that I need to do. There's a life work that's calling to me that I can choose to kind of align my life with. So I just wanted to bring up definitions there because I think this term can often be pretty confusing. And there are just a lot of definitions out there of calling and how it relates to career calling. Last few thoughts on career calling. There's actually just some questions as usual, like how do you connect to the concept of a career calling? Does that construct kind of resonate with you? What are your just kind of gut reactions when you hear about that? And so the article is obviously talking about assessing for career calling. So why would it be important or beneficial to assess for career calling? So like what value would that add to practitioners or for clients? So I think those are some things to maybe be thinking about as you're reading the article. I think it really depends on the assessment of the purpose of the assessment and kind of the outcomes and the objectives of it that might answer some of those questions. But I just wanted you to kind of be thinking and reflecting and kind of critically considering the use of assessment with this construct. And the last thing about it, that I think career calling kind of shifts away from a future orientation. A lot of times in career counseling, people feel that it needs to be very future focused. Obviously, you're making future plans, future goals for your career. But a calling can often be much more of like a present moment experience. So for example, in my life, I feel that something that I feel like called to, or a work that just kind of continues to resonate with me, is to like help people really experience deeper level transformations, kind of shifting their way of being in the world. That's where I feel like really at home. And I feel like, once again, that's why I'm sometimes drawn to career counseling work, because, I think that transformation often occurs in career work, sometimes at really core levels. So anyways, I invite you to kind of share your thoughts or think about your thoughts with, does that kind of resonate with you, that career work and calling work doesn't always have to be this future orientation. Sometimes it's just like this experience that I can experience in a lot of different ways. Like for me, I could help people experience deep transformations in a lot of different ways as a counselor, as an instructor. There's lots of different ways, so it's not just one career role that has to have one clear like future path too. It's like I experienced that in my relationship with my wife and my kids, and in my a lot of the different communities that I'm a part of. All right, so there's some thoughts on career calling. The next article, the Hutchison article, I had some reactions to, and I think that was the purpose. I think Hutchinson did that on like intentionally, but it's kind of talking about bringing a critical lens to career development work. So on page 236 of the article, there's a quote here by Horkheimer on critical theory. And I think there's a lot today in the media. It's kind of like a lot of reactions to critical theory or critical race theory. Critical theory is a little bit more broad than like specifically like critical disability theory or critical race theory. But at its core, Horkheimer talked about how, you know, the idea of critical theory is to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. So I think that kind of speaks to the goal of critical theory from my understanding, my lens. So oftentimes critical theory just kind of has to do with exploring and overcoming systemic barriers or injustices. And I think, like I said before, that this article really is a larger critique of career development and kind of using critical theory to challenge, you know, the status quo of career development. So if you have strong reactions to this article, then once again, I think that was the goal of the author. I think those reactions are an invitation to kind of make sense of, okay, what's coming up for me? What are my beliefs? What are my values? How are those maybe being challenged or pushed? And I think that's a good thing. And I think that's a part of this course and of becoming a counselor, is like being able to really wrestle with some of these core values and beliefs that we have. And yeah, so if anyone, you know, if you're experiencing those strong reactions, I'd really encourage you to chat with me about them. I'd be happy to talk those out, and with other, you know, trusted people that you have in the program. Okay, well, one example of kind of what I think might be an example of like a strong reaction, on page 238, it talked about how, you know, one challenge or critique of career development work was that it was only research only reflected Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations, which they titled as weird populations. So once again, that's probably meant to kind of lead to some reactions of kind of flipping the table of, you know, maybe for career development, I think the critique is that the dominant culture has been Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, but that doesn't necessarily include all perspectives and perceptions of all, you know, communities. So perhaps, you know, that weird acronym was used to encourage critical consciousness, you know, critical thought, critical thinking of norms and dominant groups, to hopefully grow and be more reflective of assumptions and dominant perspectives. So overall, from this article, I think the emphasis was on environmental exploration and critique, challenging the environment, challenging, you know, the status quo, and then also trying to really encourage and honor personal agency, which I think was an interesting kind of tension. And it's kind of important that, like, the individual's agency and maybe the limits and challenges or barriers created by an environment. So let's see here. So one critique I have with this article that I wanted to bring up here was that on page 243, it talks about how the unjust world of work. And I think they give some examples, or Hutchison gives some examples of what they mean by like an unjust world of work. But I think it could have been helpful to share more specifics, like specifically what are they referencing with the unjust world of work. I think there's general examples shared, but I think when there's like some critiques and challenges, it can kind of help to maybe have a case study or something. I think that could have maybe really been helpful here. To give more some specifics, but maybe Hutchison, you know, just wanted more broadly to address these challenges rather than kind of get into the small details of like a career counseling session. But I think sometimes that can limit the kind of the theory and critique to practice on kind of like a pragmatic level. So yeah, I think those are my main thoughts from this article. Once again, I think the goal is to just be reflective, to kind of have assumptions challenged, and to kind of reflect on dominant norms, dominant communities, and kind of the mainstream view of career development. So personally, I really think that's a worthy, I guess, experience and, topic to reflect upon is, what are the core assumptions of the career development theories, of the approaches. And like I said, we're going to start getting into a lot more of the special topic theories. So we're going to kind of start to broaden and get away from just the developmental perspectives that we've been talking about in the trait and factor. So with that being said, that's the article, or that's the kind of my thoughts on the articles and the video for this week. So I look forward to learning with you again this week, and continue to reach out if you need help or have any questions. Thanks.